I now have the privilege to invite my friend Brad Moodie, and I have a curveball to throw at you. Brad, good morning to you at first, and Happy New Year. We haven't spoken since the New Year, so it's great to have you back with us.
Yeah, it's been a long time. Good to be back on the show. Thanks, team.
All right, are you ready for a curveball, my friend?
Give it to me, mate.
Ezra chapter 10. Ezra commands the Israelites to divorce their wives and even their children, to let them go away because they were foreigners. Is God in favor of divorce now? What is going on? Would you do this? Have you ever recommended anyone to divorce and just let their wives and children go? Is that something that you do in your pastoral ministry regularly?
No, and that is truly a curveball, a very tricky question, and a verse that has left a lot of people with questions as to the consistency of God, and perhaps people have thrown out faith altogether on account of texts, passages such as this, and so we certainly want to deal with that.
Yes.
Now, keeping in mind that this is a twofold thing, this isn't just an issue that was in Ezra's day, it was also in Nehemiah's day, where the same issue rises again. But yes, in Ezra chapter 9 and chapter 10, the issue is intermarriage with foreign women from surrounding peoples. So Ezra is a priest and a scribe, and he is arriving in Jerusalem, leading another wave of returnees from exile. Soon he learns that many of the men, including the priests and leaders, have married these neighboring groups, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, etc. And Ezra's response is one of profound grief. And you need to understand the heart of this leader at this point in time. He tears his clothes, he pulls his hair, and he sits down in mourning and prays a raw confession of sin. You can see here that Ezra's intention is, he doesn't think that this is a good thing in any way, and dealing with it, he understands there's a gravity here, so he's not taking it lightly. So it's important that we contextualize it with that. But he essentially calls this unfaithfulness that is adding to Israel's guilt. And it's echoing, and this is really important to get, it's echoing the very reasons for their exile, which they're now just starting to come back from 70 years prior. So that the idolatry creeping in through these alliances is something that cannot be tolerated. It cannot be permitted. And he recognizes the gravity of that. So although it might not have seemed such at the time, it might have just seemed like, oh yeah, a couple of people married, people that weren't of their same ethnicity or their faith or whatever. It was a crisis, and it needed prompt and careful administration. And so you see here in the story that he prays publicly. There's a large crowd that gathers, and they're also weeping. And then notice this, it is Shechaniah, one of the leaders, that speaks up, and he says, "We have been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women. Now let us make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who fear the commands of our God. Let it be done," notice this, "according to the law." So Ezra agrees with that, and he calls an assembly in the rain and urges the people to separate from their foreign wives. And over the next few months, they investigate it case by case, those who have pledged to put away their wives and their children born to them. The text says that they did it, dissolving these unions to restore obedience to the covenant. So it's important to note when we're reading the story that the proposal was from Shechaniah, and Ezra goes along with it. It's not just one leader imposing it upon them. The people recognized the problem and committed to fixing it. I don't know what that says to you guys. Does that speak volumes to you of the importance of maintaining a collective move towards integrity in faith?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And look, I like how you mentioned, because the law that they were quoting here is probably from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3.
That's right.
Where God says, but God doesn't say do not marry foreign women, period. It says do not marry women from those very specific Canaanite tribes. These were the ones that were worshiping Moloch and practicing children sacrifices and so on. They had some really, really hideous practices here. So the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, these ites that were, because Moses himself was married to a non-Israelite woman. He was married to a Cushite woman, which is like a Ethiopian, South Sudan kind of region, and there's no problem with that ever. And it's interesting also. Interesting that you pointed out the fact that these men, they knew that they were doing something wrong against the law.
That's right.
They felt guilty about it, and the desire actually departed from them. It was not imposed to them.
Yes.
That being said,
that's right.
What would happen? Because look, Brad, let's say that you were a missionary, you're sharing the gospel and you're, going to foreign lands. Perhaps you're going to, a country where polygamy is practiced. Would you, in that sort of a scenario, say, look, you only have to be married to like one wife, and the other 3 wives that you have that depend on you, you have to send them away. Surely, I would imagine that you wouldn't impose that burden on them. But what's different here? What was going to happen when these women and children are being sent away? Isn't that going to create more problems than it solves?
Yeah, look, and I want to just clarify. It's a really good point that you raised there. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul, addressing New Testament believers, essentially says that if you're already married to an unbeliever and they are content to stay, because notice here we're talking about spirituality here. We're not necessarily talking about ethnicity like you highlighted before. We're talking about believers and unbelievers, and this is essentially what was taking place in Ezra's time as well. And so Paul addresses that, and he says, if you're married to an unbeliever and they are content to stay, don't divorce them. The believing spouse can have a sanctifying influence upon them. So he's not necessarily saying to just, annul all marriages of people that are of different faiths. What they're trying to do here is find the best of a bad situation. This is really what it all comes down to. And so if we're missionary.
Oh, Brad, I think we are losing you. Can you listen? Can you hear us?
To them that they should divorce, but that they should seek to maintain their personal spiritual integrity. The difference, as you highlighted as well just a moment ago, is that the Israelites at this point, they should have known better. It was fundamentally different from them marrying these women that have a different faith or have these perverted faiths that were committing vile practices, and the influence that would have. It echoes back to the situation of that world-destroying flood in Noah's day, where it says that the thoughts and intents of men's hearts had become only evil continually. The context of that statement is that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and that they were fair and began marrying them. And that intermarriage between those that were previously faithful to God and those that were not was what led to the decline of spirituality and morality. And this is what we're trying to focus in on. This is what the Bible is as a whole trying to develop in people, is spiritual integrity, is purity of thought and mind. And these particular marriages at such a time when the Israelite nation was in such a fragile state, having just come out of the Babylonian captivity, they are in a critical period, and drastic measures were necessary in order to maintain that integrity so that they wouldn't go backwards and end up in the same place that had led to going into captivity in the first place. Yeah. Is that making sense?
It does make sense.
But notice, just to clarify, hold your thought, and I'll come back to you in a second, but okay. I want to also just clarify that Paul in 2 Corinthians, this is the letter after he's just said if you're married to an unbeliever and they're happy to stay, don't divorce them. In 2 Corinthians, he actually warns strongly against, once again, being unequally yoked together with unbelievers. So don't sign up to a marriage where you're of a different faith, not necessarily ethnicity. Once again, I'm myself personally, I'm married to someone of a different culture as well. What he's talking about is spirituality. He's talking about integrity as far as your capacity to maintain connection with God. Now, back onto your thought there. Go for it, Joseph.
Yes. No, look, there's a few things here. There's a list of all of the men that made that. It's not a lot of people. There's I haven't counted them, but I would say it's about 50 cases. And in verse 17, it says here that I find very interesting, that it says that they were investigating like case by case.
That's right. Yes.
So to see absolutely. Like repercussions and so on. And this is the thing as well. They were in Babylon. They had married these foreign wives, these Canaanite wives, while they were in Babylon. So they knew full well that the thing that brought them to Babylon in the first place was their unfaithfulness to the covenant, and they acted upon it. But the other thing as well that I mentioned here, and again here, I think this is perhaps a bit of speculation on my part. The Bible is not explicit about it, but I think it's not too far off to imagine that if you are an exile in a foreign land, we know from documents, archaeological documents, that a lot of Jews did really well in Babylon, and some of them even become very wealthy. Babylon allowed them to kind of really restart their lives and plant vines and build houses and build businesses. And it says here in verse 19 that they offered a ram of their flock for their offense, and a ram was offered for people that of means. So would it be too far to imagine that, hey, look, we are looking at them. The vast majority of these men, they didn't have children. And basically what they're doing, normally you would pay a large sum, a dowry, equivalent sometimes at up to 1 to 7 years worth of wages to the wife's father, that they would revert them back to them. So they would be in a place where, look, you will be officially divorced. This is a once in a history kind of event. The women were able and free to marry again, and from their culture, it was probably not a shameful thing to do. They were well set up financially, and among them, only a few had children. And we don't know here about the ages of the children and what the arrangements were, if they had access to the parent as well. But so I think that this is the thing about this, the difficulty about this passage is that they're really looking at each case by case.
Case by case.
And nothing was imposed on anyone here.
No, that's right. And it took a long time. And you can already see, like I said at the start, the heart of the leadership in dealing with this. They're being very, very gentle, very diplomatic, and very careful about the way they handle it. And as you've also rightly pointed out, the custom of the era suggests that the former husbands would have arranged adequate support for the return of these wives and their children back to their family homes. They would have certainly given them sufficient to make it as painless as possible, and certainly there's no downplaying this. People would have been hurt. This would have been a hard thing to do, a really difficult period in time. But keep in mind that these unions were not so much. It's not as strictly a divorce, biblically speaking, as much as it is seen that these unions were actually invalid from the start under the law. Introducing so essentially this nullifying of sin is what this was all about, not so much about casually dissolving valid marriages. It's just really important to note that, and this is really what's going on here. They're attempting to get back to their roots of faith and integrity, as we've been talking about, as we've been highlighting.
Wow, this is very interesting. There's so much here to unpack, Brad, in that story, and I love how you were really helping us to take a step back and look at the various items here. I have a question for you. Do you think that if these women said, look, if they came to these women and said, look, my allegiance is with God first, and I'm not even allowed to marry you. However, if you would like to follow my God as well, the God of Israel, the creator of the heavens and the earth, then we can stay married. Do you think that if these women were on board with that idea, that this would have also solved the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really important point to note as well, Joseph. I'm glad you raised that. You see, you can see the example in the story of Ruth, where you have this Moabitess who has lost her husband even still, but has caught wind of the faith of the Israelites by Naomi, who is the only remaining, indirect relative for her. She's not by blood, but she's effectively become a mother to her. And she makes this statement of faith as she decides that she's going to go with Naomi back to Israel, who's been away for a number of years, and she's been sent by Naomi back to her homeland. So go back to your people, Ruth, and just find a new life and start again. And she says, I'm not going to. I'm going to stay with you. And she makes this statement of faith where she says, I'm going to go where you go. Your people will be my people. I will die where you you die and your God will be my God. And this, if they were to make those kinds of statements, then they would become an Israelite, not necessarily by birth, but by proclamation. And so it adds a really important element to this story, where you understand that if these women had come to a realization of the beauty of the faith of the Israelites as it was written down in the Word of God, if people had been faithful in keeping it, then they would have seen that beauty and they would have stepped into that space or desired to. And if so be, then they could have certainly become one with the Israelite nation. And so it's quite possibly a part of their own desire to want to go back to their people rather than to convert to the Israelite religion that stemmed a lot of those moves back to Babylon, as you're highlighting there. Really good point.
Well, thank you so much, Brad. That's some really insightful conversation here. And again, I think that is a good methodology when we see perplexing Bible passages. We need to step back a little bit, understand the context, and say, hey, sometimes these are very complicated, very complex situations, and we are really having to navigate. And what is the least worst outcome in certain circumstances?
Exactly right. And this is what's really important to know. And this is the principle for us to take home is, for example, in the New Testament, where Paul is addressing the need to stay faithful where you've been found. The Israelites should have known better. They had the covenant already. But as we move into the New Testament Christian era, the people were coming in from all walks of life, and many of which were already married before coming to a knowledge of truth. So for them, Paul says, you can have an influence. But the Israelites were essentially undermining their influence by compromising on the principles they already knew. So the story of Ezra and Nehemiah's time is about crisis management for the maintenance of spiritual integrity, not xenophobia, as some would suggest, and the idea of is separating ethnically. It's a genuine crisis for a fragile group of people, not a template for today's marriages. But it certainly challenges us. How can we make sure that we guard against the influences that erode faithfulness? That's really the principle, the take-home message.
Absolutely. Brad, thank you so much. And if you come across, listening friend, any perplexing passages of Scripture, let me know which passage are you talking about here. 0491-064-669. Send us your perplexing passage, and I'm going to throw your curveball back at Brad, and he's going to research for us, and he's going to help us understand, navigate, understand, and love the Word of God, and understand the principles and the history behind some of these more difficult passages. Brad, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you looking into that subject for us.